Morning everyone, thank you for coming out today. What a fantastic turnout, thank you. So before we get started and walk through the country, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Boonwurrung and the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So again, thank you all for coming. My name is Andrew Tucker. I'm the General Manager of Research and Development at Melbourne CRC. And just for those of you who don't know much about CRCs and what the program is, so a CRC, or a Cooperative Research Centre, is an industry-focused research and development consortium that is looking to bring together research expertise and industry partners in order to produce systems and tools that can be commercialised by the industry partners. So that's what we're all about, and that's what we're all in CRCs are. So our CRC, which is called the Cooperative Research Centre for Alertness, Safety and Productivity, which is a bit of a mouthful, Alertness CRC for short. So we've got lots of academic and industry partners that we have together to work on things to enhance alertness management, and also enhance sleep health management. So a great example of this kind of collaboration is the collaboration we have between Versalux Lighting Systems and Monash University. That's what we're going to talk about today. So I'll quickly go through the agenda. We're going to start off with Associate Professor Claire Anderson on the philosophy of inadequate sleep, then the scientific facts on lighting with Associate Professor Sean Kane, and then the final presentation is Vince Macri from Versalux Lighting Systems to talk about the MelaGen product. A few housekeeping things. The bathrooms are down the hallway, with ladies on the left and on the right, and the networking lunch will be out in the foyer where we will have coffee. So tea and coffee are available the whole time throughout. Alright, I will now introduce the first speaker, Associate Professor Claire Anderson. So Claire is a theme leader with the Alertness CRC, an Associate Professor and Sleep and Circadian Alternate Institute for Brain and Mental Health at Monash University. Her research is focused on the contribution of sleep and circadian timing on alertness and cognitive function, and the development of targeted sleep and circadian strategies to maximise alertness, enhance cognitive health, and promote occupational safety and productivity. Welcome, Claire.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Andy, for the introduction. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today for this roadshow. And also, a very happy birthday to Bruno from Versalux. It's a great way to celebrate your birthday. It's a good one. It's 21 again. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the cost of inadequate sleep. And I think it's fair to say that all of us in the room have had a bout of insufficient sleep at some point in lives, whether it's a looming deadline at work, whether it is family responsibilities, and if you're Bruno tonight, too much partying. So it's okay when we've had a night of sleep to feel the effects of inadequate sleep, and we can put management strategies in place to deal with that. But what is very obvious is that for around 40% of Australians and people in most Western societies, for 40% of those people, inadequate sleep becomes a chronic problem. In that scenario, these individuals struggle with being at their best and performing cognitively at their best. They struggle with their moods and their emotions, and this comes at a cost to the individual, it comes at a cost to their friends, their family, the organisations at which they are employed, and also comes at a cost to society. So I'm going to be covering the costs of those situations in terms of the individual and their performance, and in terms of Australia at large. So if we think about inadequate sleep and what causes inadequate sleep, it is impossible to say that there is a single cause to people not obtaining sufficient sleep. So if we look at the most common reasons why people don't obtain enough sleep, we can see that they don't allow themselves a sufficient sleep opportunity. It can be because of their circadian timing, that they're not sleeping at an optimal time where the circadian system is promoting sleep, and I think Sean is going to delve into this a little bit more deeply. they may have a sleep disorder, whether that's known or unknown. They may have poor light exposure, which we know delays sleep onset and can alter the architecture of sleep. It can alter the recovery function of sleep. They may have poor sleep hygiene, such as having caffeine at the wrong time, utilising technologies at the wrong time, and excessive napping during the day. They can also have things like stress and anxiety, which affects both the ability to fall asleep and the capacity to remain asleep during the night. You'll see that there are some reasons there that have a bidirectional relationship, so circadian timing, stress and anxiety from light exposure, being a couple of examples, and these are particularly important, and these are the ones that we really need to address, because once you have a bidirectional relationship, we generally have this kind of vicious feedback loop where we have to intervene to promote sleep. So what is the cost of inadequate sleep, whatever the reason? I'm going to talk about the cost of sleep and its impact on performance, how it impacts people at work, and how this impacts society. So starting off with how it impacts performance, this would be a much shorter talk if I told you how it does not affect performance, and that is because it affects almost every single aspect of the way that we perform as human beings. What I'm showing you is a picture of the sleep-deprived human brain. The areas in blue are basically the areas that are not performing as optimally as they should following inadequate sleep. The areas that you see, essentially we've got an area of the brain called the thalamus. This is absolutely essential for arousal and alertness. We have the prefrontal cortex, which is critical for almost every single cognitive function, and particularly those cognitive functions that make us unique as humans. Our capacity to make decisions, our capacity to infer the emotions of somebody else and therefore change our behaviour, to control almost all aspects of our behaviour is performed by the prefrontal cortex. The parietal cortex, when this is lit up in combination with the frontal cortex, is essentially your attention network system. So what we see, therefore, is the brain is severely impacted in critical areas for alertness and attention. So anybody who's had a night of inadequate sleep, you feel sleepy, you're unable to concentrate, you are delayed in your response. And if that's a delay in answering the phone, that's okay. But if this is a delay to a stoplight, or if this is a delay to a pedestrian stepping out on the road, this presents obviously as a significant problem. We have an increase in attentional failure. We're more likely to become distracted, doing things like picking up mobile phones while driving to keep ourselves awake, and task switching. Think about your job and how you switch from one task to another, and how you do that seamlessly. If you have insufficient sleep, then you're obviously not doing that task particularly well. Cognitive functions, many of them, from logical reasoning, your capacity to utilise your memory effectively, capacity to make good decisions that are based in rational cognitive thought and not emotionally driven, your capacity to not be impulsive, poor communication, and flexible thinking. So alertness, attention, cognitive function, and emotional regulation. Think about a night where you've not had enough sleep, or a partner's not had enough sleep, or a colleague that you work with, and we might think, oh, they're a bit grumpy. But the reality is people are frustrated, they become irritable, they are reactive to emotional stimuli, and it makes them very difficult to interact with on a social level. This is not what we want to see in workplaces. So in terms of, I'm going to go through each of these to give examples of the science behind them, just to show you how problematic this is, but also that this is happening every day, and you may or may not be aware of how problematic this is. So this is a pretty seminal study from our field of research where we looked at, sorry, not we didn't, but the field did. Hans van Dongen in the US looked at days of sleep restriction, so they kept people in the lab for 14 days. If somebody was allocated to the fortunate group, they were given 8 hours time in bed, and then each day they completed a task called the psychomotor vigilance task. This is a task where you have a single stimulus, and all you have to do is respond as quickly as possible to that stimulus. So it's just clearly a measure of reaction time. So what they see is for each day, 8 hours time in bed, you can see the reaction time changing with each day. Another group were assigned 6 hours time in bed, another group were assigned 4 hours time in bed, and the unlucky group were basically given no sleep over 3 continuous days. Yeah. So it sounds terrible, nobody wants to be in the 0 hour sleeper group, but actually what they found in this study, which is really important, is that those individuals who had 6 hours time in bed, 14 consecutive days, had the same level of performance impairment that we see here as somebody who had 1 night without sleep. Somebody who had 4 hours time in bed after 7 days, same level of performance impairment as 1 night without sleep. So when I said to you, no sleep whatsoever, everyone's like, oh, it's terrible, we can't do that, we don't want to do that. But the reality is your capacity to perform after 1 night without sleep is the same as somebody who has 6 hours of sleep continuously for 2 weeks. And this is a large majority of our society. If you ask yourselves who regularly gets 6 hours of sleep, there will be a large number of people in this room putting their hands up saying, that is me. I'm also going to tell you that if this is you, and you are having 6 hours of sleep every night continuously, not only are you performing the same as somebody who's had 1 night without sleep, you are also performing the same as somebody who is double the legal limit to drive. So this is a study where they compared hours of wakefulness with blood alcohol concentration, and for an individual who's had between 17 and 19 hours awake, so this is just a few hours past normal bedtime, they have the same level of performance impairment as somebody who has a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05. For somebody who has been awake for 21 to 24 hours, or 6 hours time in bed for 2 weeks, you have the same level of performance impairment of somebody with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.08 to 0.1. So it's not just simply attention. If you think about how many times you simply stare at a screen and you respond to a single stimulus, it doesn't happen very often. It happens for people in airport security, monitoring safety critical systems, or nurses in the ICU. But for the majority of us, we're performing in extremely distracted environments. There's lots going on at any one time. So we ask the question, well, what happens when you have other things going on in the room when people are trying to perform these tasks? So we had people completing the same task with PVT. We put a TV 90 degrees to the periphery, and we said to them, do not watch the TV. We want you to do the task to the best of your ability and respond as quickly as possible. We monitored where they were looking, what their eyes were doing, what their brain was doing, and of course, how they were doing on the task. What we found is what we expected, that after 5 hours of sleep, people had a 126% increase in attention failure. When we add that with a simple distractor, we find a 321% increase in attention failure when we have one single distractor. So again, think about your workplaces and what's going on around you. There will be phones, there will be other screens, there will be colleagues. Your capacity to deal and inhibit and ignore those distractors after sleep restriction is severely compromised. This just shows you the true extent of the problem. This one shows you that they have to be distracted at the same time that stimuli appears. If we just look at distraction, full stop, irrespective of whether that resulted in an attention failure, you can see over 1,000% increase in people looking at that screen. They were seeking stimulation to keep themselves awake, even though we were paying them not to look at that screen. Money doesn't help. Money doesn't counter sleep loss, right? So, sleep loss and executive function. So, the executive functions are essentially an umbrella term to refer to a set of cognitive processes that allow us to have a cognitive control of our behaviour. The 3 core components are inhibitory control, inhibiting things that we shouldn't be paying attention to, working memory, keeping things active in the brain and being able to respond and utilise that information being retained, and cognitive flexibility, shifting between different items. So we can see here, this is data from our group. Once we get into the nighttime hours, we see a change in inhibitory control. People cannot inhibit an automatic response to a stimulus. And then this doesn't recover. We normally see a recovery with the circadian clock time, but we don't see any recovery on the second day due to sleep deprivation. Same with working memory. Also, just an example from our group, we see a 3 hours time awake relative to 27 hours time awake, and we see that they're 24 hours apart, so we keep the time of day constant, that there is a reduction in working memory for these individuals. And the same with cognitive flexibility. You can see here that there is a cost to sleep deprivation, particularly when performed in the morning hours. So sticking with the prefrontal cortex, works hardest during the day. Because it works hardest during the day, it kind of has a preferential recovery during sleep at night. So that's why it's so vulnerable to sleep deprivation. And the recovery function of sleep is largely slow wave sleep, and Nick Sean's going to talk a little bit more about slow wave sleep. So the prefrontal cortex is particularly important and particularly vulnerable to sleep deprivation. So when we're thinking about the way that we manage our emotions, what we have is a social cognitive system in the brain. So we have a very ancient system which allows us to respond to threat, and it allows us to respond to threat very quickly, and that is the amygdala. So if you see something that poses as a threat, your amygdala will respond. It's your fight or flight response, and it will respond very quickly. And then what should happen is that the prefrontal cortex kicks in. It's got this kind of cognitive, rational perspective that says either we're going and we're moving, or most of the time it says there's no threat, let's not worry. But with sleep deprivation, the prefrontal cortex isn't working the way that it should be working, and so what we would expect is this huge increase in amygdala response. So this group looked at this. What is the brain doing when it sees negative items? So they simply put people in a brain scanner, they show them images of different severity, ranging from pretty neutral, happy images, through to quite negative images. And then they looked at what the brain did purely by looking at these images. So this one here, assume this is coming on the screen. So this one here is the well-rested group, and what we can see in the well-rested group is that the amygdala lights up as it should. But what we see in the sleep-deprived group is a huge response from the amygdala. A 60% increase in amygdala activation and a 3-fold increase in the amount of the amygdala that was being activated. So we get this huge emotional response purely by looking at the picture of a snake or an insect or a wasp. We ask why that is, so we look at the prefrontal cortex. When you see images in red, it means that the sleep-deprived group is showing a stronger response. When you see it in yellow, it means that the well-rested group is showing a stronger response. What we see, sleep-deprived group, extremely emotional, being driven by that amygdala response, and the well-rested group is this frontal control of emotions, saying, calm down, it's okay. So does this affect our behaviour? We looked at this in the lab, and we basically gave people a simple task where they had words shown to them on the screen. Sometimes they responded to those words, and sometimes we asked them to inhibit the response to those words. So if it's an emotional word, we want you to inhibit and pull back. We looked at how a positive and a negative word changed the way they responded. So what we have here, positive and negative stimuli across the bottom, we have their hit rate. We don't want to see hit rate. We don't want to see people responding to this stimuli. But with sleep deprivation, what we found, when it's negative, they respond. And not only do they respond, when it's negative, they respond much more quickly. So what we're seeing then with sleep deprivation is enhanced reactivity to negative stimuli. And if we think about sleep loss, and particularly working during the night, people don't make happy, positive decisions at 3 o'clock in the morning. They're not choosing whether they're buying the blue car or the red car. They are emergency responders, making a decision whether they are transporting somebody to a hospital or are they treating somebody at the side of the road. Am I moving? They are people in trade negotiations. They are juries deliberating overnight of pretty severe cases where it's going through the nighttime hours. So actually looking at this response to negative stimuli in our real environments is very important. Talking about financial decisions, this is a study where we actually got people playing games that did require them to make decisions for real money. And it was a very simple game. And essentially what they had is, we had $10 and we shared that $10 between 2 people. The first person could offer as much as that $10 to be shared as they like. And the second person had a choice. They can either accept the money, in which case they both get the money, or they can say no, in which case they both get nothing. So imagine we were playing and I've got $10 and I choose to share with you. I'm going to keep 6 and I'm going to give you $4. Who's taking the money? Anybody not taking the money? Good. I'm going to keep $9 and I'm going to give you $1. Anybody not taking the money? Perfect. We have a well-rested audience. And what happens with sleep deprivation, and it was a very, very clear finding, is people said no. As soon as they perceived it to be an unfair offer, they said no. And we're talking 50%. If it was less than 50%, they don't want it. So they're playing for real money, making real decisions. And so what we found is that people were basically cutting their nose off to spite their face. They were making poor decisions that were emotionally driven. So how does this affect us at work? Inadequate sleep at work is a huge problem. Like I was saying, around 40% of Australians are not getting enough sleep, and this makes them 70% more likely to be involved in an accident at work. In a recent survey in Australia in the past month, 70% of people missed work due to sleepiness. They're too sleepy and they called in sick. 70% of people also reported that they fell asleep on the job in the past month. In the past 3 months, 29% of people said they made errors due to their sleepiness. This is a huge problem. And these are the errors that people are aware of, not many of them that have passed by without being noticed. How do they make you feel? 7 out of 10 people, so around 70%, said they struggle to handle stress, they struggle to concentrate, around 60%, they struggle to problem solve, they struggle to listen to their colleagues. If we think about this kind of the workplace that this creates, it's a problem. Even if one person, breaks down in a team and they're struggling to concentrate and handle the stress around them, they're not listening to their colleagues, we have a problem. We also think about the time and resources that companies spend on trying to get the best out of their team. We want people to be their absolute best, and we send them on courses and we do team building exercises. And what we realise is that the best performance enhancement is free, and that is sleep. So this can go beyond not paying attention in the workplace, not being able to handle stress. If we look at the incidence of drowsy driving, this is a huge problem on our roads. It is not going away. A recent survey by the Transport Accident Commission has shown that the problem is growing over the past 3 years. It is not dissipating. If we look at the number of hours sleep, drivers who sleep between 4 and 5 hours, this is typically somebody who gets around 6 hours time in bed, they're 4.5 times more likely to crash. If this goes under 4 hours, they are 11.5 times more likely to crash. And recent statistics out of the US suggest that this is closer to 15 times the risk. We've already talked about that these drivers are essentially driving the same as somebody who is drunk. And what I think about in terms of somebody who falls asleep at the wheel, I see it as a kind of euphemism, that when somebody's fallen asleep at the wheel, they have basically pushed themselves to such a limit that they lose consciousness behind the wheel of a car. If we think about that in terms of drugs or alcohol, if somebody would drink enough alcohol that they lose consciousness behind the wheel of a car, we are completely intolerant of that, and we need to be exactly intolerant to the same effects from inadequate sleep. And microsleep is probably the hallmark sign of somebody having inadequate sleep. This is where the brain uncontrollably enters a sleep state. It can happen between 3 and 15 seconds. You will be unaware that your brain has gone into a sleep state for this period of time. We have no consciousness of microsleeps. A driver who has a microsleep of 4 seconds may not sound very long, but this car traveling 100 kilometers an hour will travel 111 meters without somebody being in control of that car. They cause 20% of all crashes, and 1 in 25 people admit to pushing themselves to the limit that they lose consciousness behind the wheel of a car. So what is the cost to us as a society? If we look at inadequate sleep here is defined as somebody who says, I didn't get enough sleep last night, or they're saying, I feel excessively sleepy during the day. 4 in 10 Australians suffer from inadequate sleep, 7.4 million people. It's not simply because they have a sleep disorder. These are everyday people like you or I trying to keep up with work demands and families and social lives and all of those things where it's easy to curtail sleep. It's easy to ramp up the lights at night, keeping ourselves awake, pushing our limits at the end of the day, getting up early and keeping on going. These are the people who sit here reporting excessive daytime sleepiness, reporting insufficient sleep, and you can see that they're largely those people who are in employment. The Sleep Health Foundation commissioned Deloitte to look at the financial cost of sleep loss in Australian society, and over a single year, the cost of inadequate sleep in Australia was $66.3 billion, and this is huge. It was divided into $40.1 billion in loss of well-being. So what they do is basically look at the cost to healthy life and the loss of healthy life. due to inadequate sleep. And then they look at the financial costs, and that's 26.2 billion, largely comprised of productivity losses of 17.9 billion and health system costs of people requiring medical intervention because of insufficient sleep. We can see largely workplace injuries, motor vehicle crashes, and depression. So this is the everyday. These are people with inadequate sleep, maybe having a lapse in attention, maybe making a wrong decision, maybe that they just failed to inhibit a response and they have acted in the wrong way. But when those simple mistakes combine with the perfect storm, this is not a simple decision that nobody notices anymore. These are major catastrophes that happen due to inadequate sleep and human error. And these are just a couple of examples. They're the only ones I could fit on the slide. There are many more that I could have put on there. But you can see that they span across a number of years. This is not a recent nor an old problem. And you can see that it goes across different sectors, from anything from control rooms to shipping, to rail, to road transportation, even through to space travel, where you think that we've got every kind of possible safety net in place to make sure that this doesn't happen. So I've essentially covered the cost to cognition. Obviously, there is a much wider cost to inadequate sleep. Cognition is an acute effect. If you had a bad sleep last night, it will affect your cognition today. But essentially, people who continue to expose themselves to inadequate sleep, the cost is much worse. We can look at the effects on health, stroke, increased risk of stroke, increased risk of gaining weight and developing obesity, increased risk of developing diabetes, change in hormonal responses, and an increase in hormonal cancers, such that the World Health Organization has listed shift work as a possible carcinogenic, and depression and anxiety. And this leads us now to we have very clear evidence that sleep is absolutely the third pillar of health: diet, exercise, and sleep. We know we need to have good diet, we know we need good exercise, we have to have good sleep. And how I look at this, I think sleep is absolutely critical, and that is because diet in the long term is not a poor diet. If you eat the wrong thing today, you're probably going to be okay. If you decide you're not going to exercise today, you're probably going to be okay. If you, for whatever reason, don't have enough sleep tonight, you're not going to be okay tomorrow, and you will experience the kind of things that I've just talked about for the previous 20 minutes. And with that, hopefully I've given you a snapshot into the cost of inadequate sleep, and I thank you for your attention and invite questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Do we have any questions?
Thanks, Claire, for a very interesting talk. You showed at the start a graph where you had there was a study which showed the 4 different groups having 8 hours or 6 hours sleep, 4 and 0. So there was a very clear trend there, but what I was missing was the variability from person to person.
Yeah.
Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, so there is huge variability in how people respond to sleep deprivation. So roughly they'll say about a third of people are relatively resilient, a third of people are kind of a typical response to sleep loss, and a third of people are extremely vulnerable. But this is relative to each other. We are still trying to find out what are the individual differences that causes some people to cope with sleep loss versus those who don't. There is a genetic composition, and we know some genes, but we certainly don't know a full genetic profile. There are sex differences in how people respond to sleep deprivation, and Sean has a particular expertise in sex differences. But we certainly have not got to a point where we can say this person is the profile of somebody who cannot cope with sleep deprivation. And it's something we need to do as scientists to find out, so we can. We don't want to profile and stop people engaged in things like shift work, but we do need to profile so that we can offer more support for those people who don't cope particularly well. But there are very clear individual differences. Yeah.
Sorry. Thanks very much. Just wanted to, pretty much a similar question. To what extent in those studies was the existing sleep patterns of the participants taken into account? So where was somebody going from 8 hours to 4 and not coping, or were you matching to see what their normal day-to-day life was like?
Yeah, so when we do these studies, we typically control for that. So anybody who's coming into one of these kind of extensive sleep studies, they are healthy sleepers. They typically sleep between 7 and 9 hours. They don't have any sleep disturbance. They have no presence of sleep disorders. They have good sleep efficiency, which means that they spend most of their time in bed asleep. They have full psychiatric assessments, all those things. So we try and control for that because we know that prior sleep history is going to change the way that they respond. If we take a 6-hour sleeper and they go into the 6-hour sleeper group, it changes everything. So these are people who typically sleep between 7 and 9 hours, and then they've been exposed to sleep restriction.
So is it possible the results are skewed by the fact that you're suddenly giving 4 hours sleep and they can't go?
I don't think we have to do these studies in that way, otherwise you have too much noise in the data to be able to make anything out of the data. But what it tells you is that any change from their habitual sleep is going to be problematic. For somebody who is coming in preloaded with fatigue, the problem is even worse. So there is a study where they looked at people's capacity to cope with a single night without sleep, and when they're preloaded with fatigue because they've had kind of chronic inadequate sleep, their capacity to deal with one night is severely compromised. So they're not skewed, they are specific to that population, but at the same time, if you're bringing in people who already sleep 5 hours and 4 hours, they're actually going to be much worse. So this is probably the best case scenario.
Any other questions? Oh.
Thanks, Pat. You showed with the age-related differences, but it started at 20. How much research has been done with the group that I think most of us are worried about now, which is the teenagers and less? You basically described my son the same.
Yeah, so more research now is definitely focusing on children and how much sleep children need. Children obviously need more sleep than adults. But there is again another problem with children not obtaining enough sleep, and that impacts particularly on their learning and capacity to retain information at school. It also impacts on their mood and their capacity to become emotionally reactive and all of those things. But also we're seeing a spike in depression and anxiety in teenagers as well, which is compounded by sleep deprivation. So this study was basically, it was from, it's not a study, it's a review, it's called Sleep on the Job, so it's looking at people in workplaces, but the problem isn't gone away for younger people, and in fact is probably worse.
I think you alluded to it, but what is the optimum range? Is it 7 to 9, which you referred to, and how does that vary between individuals?
Yeah, so it's like saying how much food do I need to eat to retain, to maintain a healthy life. It's a really difficult question to answer. So it's pretty generic advice that we give, and we typically say between 7 and 9 hours is what is recommended for a typical healthy adult, but there are individual differences. And so what we, think about your body and try and get a feedback from your body. If you're finding and you're struggling to stay awake during the day, you're probably not getting enough sleep. If you're finding an over-reliance on alarm clocks to wake up, so you're curtailing what would be your natural sleep, you're probably not getting enough sleep. So recommendation between 7 and 9, but at the same time, listen to your body, ask yourselves how you're feeling, and think about your behaviour in terms of alarm clocks. And that will give you some indication where you sit in that 7 to 9 hour bracket. Maybe a little bit more, a little bit less.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more question. Okay, excellent. Thanks so much,
Thank
Meg.
you.
We'll turn together.